So we have another Final Fantasy VII Rebirth interview, this time with Tetsuya Nomura and Naoki Hamaguchi, and in it they talk a little bit more about fleshing out the backstories for characters like Rufus, Yuffie, and Vincent, and we're also going to follow up on that very cryptic message from Naoki Hamaguchi in our previous video where he talks about the weapon creatures and how they could potentially affect the gameplay going forward, and how this could actually evolve combat. So if any of that sounds cool to you, or if you're new here, feel free to click the like button and subscribe if you want to stick around. It's always appreciated. So this interview comes to us from Inverse, and it was released back in September around the time of Tokyo Game Show. And because there was so much going on in regards to Rebirth, a lot of these articles just kind of flew under the radar, but they are now resurfacing, so we're going to talk about them. But before we get to that interview, let's follow up with Naoki Hamaguchi in regards to that cryptic ass message talking about the weapon creatures of FF7. And just in case you forgot what he was talking about, I'll pull back and read the quote once more. Hamaguchi says, "You know that in FF7 there are those weapon creatures. If we were to introduce them like summons as another kind of entity-like creature, do you think that would be too much, or would you enjoy it?" Now, when I first read that statement, my mind immediately went to, oh, we can recruit weapons to fight the weapons, because they've shown off in trailers that there are going to be new weapons in this game, in this universe. Red 13 talks to Tifa about them, and we even see one swimming in the water. So there's going to be more than just Diamond, Emerald, Ruby, and Sapphire. We're going to have these newer weapons that are designed for Rebirth and beyond. And what if we could find a way to find these weapon creatures, recruit them, and then use them as summons to help us fight Diamond, Ruby, and Emerald? And my main thought process there was, these weapons in the original game were massive, and I expect them to be even bigger in Rebirth and moving forward with Part 3, so there's only so much our party can do on the ground to whack them in the feet. We're going to need to find different ways to fight them, so essentially it boils down to fight weapon with weapon, which sounds cool. But the flip side of that is, what if we don't need weapons to fight the weapon? What if they evolve the combat just enough to allow our party to then fight these massive creatures in these gigantic cinematic-like summon fights? We've already fought summons before in 7 Remake in the VR simulator, and then we're probably going to fight them again in the open world in Rebirth. So what if we expand upon that gameplay and do something out of like Advent Children? There's that scene where the entire party is together and they're fighting Bahamut Sin, and people are flying through the air and jumping and running off of walls, jumping midair and double jumping and shooting at Bahamut Sin and fighting him. And you've got like Barrett stationed in one section fighting some of the minion creatures while Vincent is flipping and dipping shooting Bahamut. It's this really cool action sequence where everyone is working together. Now what if we could take that and make it into a gameplay scenario where we have different groups of our party members, a la original Final Fantasy VII with Bizarro Sephiroth, where going into that fight we could split up and make 3 different groups of our party members and switch to them throughout the battle to help fight different sections of Sephiroth. Now imagine we have that in Remake Part 3, where we have a ground party of maybe Cloud, Tifa, and Red 13. But then we've got a secondary air support party in the High Wind with maybe Barrett, Vincent, and Yuffie. And we could switch between these characters in real time to allow us to fight the weapon creatures section by section. I think that could be a really cool thing. You could even kind of look at how they did it in Dissidia NT, where you had these specific summon boss battles, which were much smaller in scale and in smaller arenas. But the idea is still the same. 3 party members fighting a gigantic summon, so that way you can recruit it and use it for your team. So maybe something along the lines of that could be really cool, but it also allows them to evolve the gameplay, not just for gameplay purposes, but again, showcase what they've been doing. Evolving the gameplay because the narrative is calling for it. The story, the bonds, the relationships, the enemies are all calling for the gameplay to evolve and rise to the occasion. So that could be something that they're also talking about in regards to these weapon creatures. And that could really change gameplay and be a ton of fun. But enough of my rambling, let's get to this Inverse article where they ask Nomura in particular about how they're going to evolve characters like Rufus for Rebirth and moving forward. Nomura says, "We won't be making immense departures from the original. With Remake, we went further in depth into Avalanche in ways that were not done in the original. This will be done for Rufus as well. He will have some sort of new episodes that do not exist in the original, where we will get to know know more about him and dig deeper. And this is already the formula that they set up with Remake moving forward. Introduce new characters and new scenarios, but also build upon the existing ones. And it kind of feels like they're taking aspects of the compilation of Final Fantasy and finding ways to weave them into the narrative and expand upon them in ways that actually work and make sense this time around with much better writing. Look, I love Final Fantasy VII, but that compilation was a mess. I thought Crisis Core was great. I really like Advent Children, even though I can acknowledge the story itself is not great. It's got some great action sequences. And then there are things that I didn't play, like Before Crisis, and things like Dirge of Cerberus, which was a nightmare. And if I remember correctly, Vincent essentially beats Weiss using the power of friendship. He distills the party's love for him into a hype beam that he uses to beat Weiss, if I remember correctly. So that in and of itself is pretty indicative of the compilation. It was just kind of all over the place, super messy, but there were some golden nuggets there in those stories and with the characters that they seem to be pulling from and weaving them into the narratives for Remake and moving forward. We saw it in Remake already with the brief mention of a Crisis Core character of Kunsel, having a bad guy like Weiss and Deepground show up in Yuffie's DLC, and even having Hojo mention Project G in the main story of Remake. That's Genesis right there. So they're doing this the right way, expanding upon elements of compilation and making them new again and fresh and much better in my opinion. Expanding upon Rufus is also great because he's going to become more than just a secondary villain now. This was a guy who played a pretty big part in Advent Children, where he recruited the talents of Cloud and his party to try and fight this new threat that was emerging. And he, along with the Turks, were essentially able to kind of hold off bad guys like Kadaj to allow Cloud and his party to do what they needed to do. And I thought that his voice actor in 7 Remake was great. He also had a great look, so fleshing him out, making him a deeper character just adds to the overall narrative, and learning things about him from the original game, which I think would technically be a spoiler, so you've been warned. Full spoiler alert coming. But Rufus does end up coming out as being the guy who's funding Avalanche, so he was actively working to fight against his father, which makes him a much more dynamic character. Going forward, they asked Nomura about pulling from supplemental materials like the novelizations and seeing if those characters will pop up in Rebirth and beyond. Nomura says, right now we're only able to talk about the characters that are depicted in the trailers that have been released thus far. But that being said, I will say that there are more characters that appear in Rebirth, perhaps even more so than Remake. Similarly for characters that are depicted in the novels and spin-offs. We'd like for players to stay tuned for more info on this as well. Now again, as big of a Final Fantasy VII fan as I am, there are things that I still don't know. I didn't read any of the novelizations. The only one I'm really kind of familiar with is Traces of Two Pasts with Tifa and Aerith, but I didn't play games like Before Crisis, and there's probably a pantheon of characters that I do not know and wouldn't recognize in Rebirth moving forward. But the fact that again, they are pulling from these supplemental stories and compilation stuff and finding ways to move them into the story that works and makes sense is great, and it makes me excited to see who exactly pops up. Like, we could see people from Crisis Core showing back up. Maybe Kunsel joins Zack's party in his timeline. Maybe Sisney comes back. Maybe Genesis will come back. Angel flashbacks. You know, there's so much that they can pull from to weave from these supplemental materials, and we saw it with Ever Crisis. They took sections of Traces of Two Pasts and put them into Ever Crisis, where you have scenes with Tifa and Jessie having a conversation. So even if it's not something super substantial, the fact that they found it important and could find a way to put it into the story to add context is great. Lastly, they talk more about Yuffie and Vincent and how their backstories will be integrated into the main story. Nomura says, firstly, for Yuffie, the order of locations that the characters explore will differ slightly in terms of her storyline with the original. With the original game, following the storyline, the party would be visiting Yuffie's hometown Wutai in the midst of that. But for Rebirth, this has been shifted to the next title, so going further in depth into the backstory will happen in the next game. Now, saving backstories for characters like Yuffie and Vincent for Remake Part 3, I'm totally fine with, and it actually does make sense. In the case of Yuffie, they've already done a really great job establishing her character with her own intermission DLC. Sure, we didn't go to Wutai and we didn't learn about her family and the trauma that she experienced with them, but they set up Yuffie well enough to leave breadcrumbs here and there to tell us about Wutai and elements of that place, good and bad. And they even do that in the main Remake story where Shinra is actively using Avalanche and Wutai as propaganda pieces to push as terrorist organizations, essentially, that are going to bring upon the downfall of Shinra and the planet, to really scare people into not trusting those specific groups of people. So having them flesh that out more in Remake Part 3 is going to be super cool. As for Vincent, I fully expect him to give a pretty brief backstory once we first find him. He's going to pop out of that coffin. He's going to talk to people, kind of tell them what they need to know at that point in time. Maybe he tells them, you know, like, I used to be a Turk, I was experimented on. The bare bones of what we need to know about Vincent will be given to us in Rebirth. But why save that stuff for Part 3? Well, it makes a lot of sense, because what is Part 3 most likely going to be? That globe-trotting kaiju adventure where we have the high wind and we can go anywhere and do anything. And with Rebirth, it feels like the story points they want to hit are all going to take place within one specific part of the world. And then that's what's going to serve the narrative for Rebirth. But in Part 3, it's probably going to be go anywhere, do anything, which means we can go to Wutai and we can learn about Yuffie. We can learn about how Shinra has affected the people of Wutai. We can learn about Yuffie's family, and she kind of doesn't really get along with them and she's got a lot of issues with them. We can visit different locations in reference to Vincent and learn more about his backstory with people like Hojo and Lucrezia and how that pertains to Sephiroth. So fleshing all that out in Part 3, when we now have the opportunity to globetrot, is the perfect time to flesh out the backstories for those characters, because there might not be the opportune time to do that in Rebirth. So why not save it for Part 3? And seemingly that's what they're doing. They're finding ways to make the story flow a little bit better, or at least in a way that makes more sense this time around. So I'm very excited to see how this stuff unfolds in Rebirth, how it's going to shape up in Remake Part 3, and how much they choose to really tell us in Rebirth in regards to some of these characters. With that being said, that is the video. I am Curious Corduroy. Let me know in the comments down below, what do you guys think of all of this news, in particular about fleshing out the characters of Rufus and maybe saving the backstories of Yuffie and Vincent for Part 3? And what do you guys think about this whole weapon creature gameplay idea that Hamaguchi has been teasing? I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.